I sold my company to secure our future. I never imagined my wife wanted the entire $2 million for herself. She shoved me from the helicopter, certain the ravine would hide the truth. Days later, the pilot told police she threatened his daughter. My name is David. I am 42 years old. Until a few days ago, I believed I was living the American dream. I was the founder of a regional logistics software firm based in Washington State. I spent 10 grueling years building that company from a single desk in our guest bedroom into an enterprise that caught the attention of major buyers. I missed holidays. I worked through anniversaries. I sacrificed my health and my sleep because I believed every late night was an investment in the woman sitting next to me. I had been married to Rebecca for 12 years. I thought she was my partner. I thought we were a team. I thought the $2 million buyout we were celebrating was our shared victory. I was a fool. We were flying 3,000 feet above the Cascade Mountains. The helicopter was a luxury charter, a surprise gift from Rebecca to celebrate the closing of the deal. She said we needed to get away to see the world from a new perspective, now that we were finally rich. The cabin was loud, filled with the heavy thumping of the rotors beating against the thin winter air. Below us, the landscape was a brutal ocean of snow-covered pine trees and jagged rock formations. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. There were no roads down there. There were no towns. There was only endless, freezing wilderness. I looked out the window and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The ink on the main contract was dry. The funds were sitting in an escrow account waiting for one final signature and the physical authentication of my cryptographic hardware key. I had that small metal key tucked safely in my breast pocket. It was the only thing standing between the bank and the final release of the $2 million. Rebecca sat across from me in the leather seat. She was wearing a thick designer coat I had bought her for our anniversary. Her blonde hair was pulled back perfectly. She looked exactly like the woman I had fallen in love with a decade ago. But when I looked into her eyes, I did not see the warmth I was used to. I thought it was just the stress of the acquisition. The past 6 months of negotiations had been brutal on both of us. She had been distant, taking phone calls in the other room, spending weekends away on what she called spa retreats to manage her anxiety. I had excused all of it. I had justified her coldness by telling myself I was a neglectful husband who worked too much. I told myself this money would fix us. She unbuckled a leather briefcase resting at her feet. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and a heavy silver pen. The noise of the helicopter made it impossible to speak at a normal volume, so she leaned close to me. Her perfume smelled like vanilla and expensive orchids. It was a scent I associated with home. She tapped the paper and spoke directly into my ear headset. "This is the final transfer authorization," she said. Her voice crackled through the comms. "The lawyers need it signed right now so they can prep the escrow release for Monday morning. You just need to sign the bottom and then we are completely done." I smiled at her. I felt a wave of relief wash over my chest. This was it, the final piece of paperwork. I took the silver pen from her hand. The helicopter hit a pocket of turbulence, bouncing us slightly in our seats. I steadied my hand against my knee and signed my name on the dotted line. 10 years of my life reduced to a single signature. I handed the paper back to her, expecting a smile. I expected her to reach out and hold my hand. I expected her to tell me she was proud of me. Instead, the moment the pen left my fingers, the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 20 degrees. Rebecca did not smile. She took the paper, folded it with mechanical precision, and slid it into her coat pocket. She took off her headset and let it rest around her neck. She looked at me with an expression of absolute disgust. It was a look you might give a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of your shoe. I lifted my own headset, slightly confused. I asked her what was wrong. She leaned forward, bringing her face inches from mine. She did not need the headset for me to hear her. Her voice cut through the mechanical roar of the chopper with a cold, terrifying clarity. "You are so weak, David," she said. Her tone was completely flat. There was no anger in it. There was no emotion at all. That was what made it so terrifying. You have always been weak. I froze. My brain could not process the words coming out of her mouth. I stared at her, waiting for a punchline, waiting for her to laugh and tell me it was a terrible joke. But her eyes were dead. You think this company was your achievement? She continued, her voice rising just enough to carry over the engine noise. You think you built this? You built nothing. I managed you for 12 years. I watched you agonize over payroll. I watched you lose sleep over clients who did not respect you. You were a pathetic, bleeding heart. You always wanted to be fair. Fair does not build empires, David. Ruthlessness does. And you do not have a single ruthless bone in your fragile body. You were a stepping stone. You were just a vehicle to get me to this exact moment. $2 million is real money, and you are too soft to handle real money. You would just give it away to your church or waste it on your useless friends. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw breath. My own wife, the woman I had slept next to for over 4,000 nights, was looking at me like I was an insect. I tried to speak. I tried to ask her what she was talking about, but the betrayal was so sudden, so absolute that my vocal cords refused to work. I felt a sickening drop in my stomach that had nothing to do with altitude. You are a failure as a man, she said, her words striking me like physical blows. My brother Greg always said you were a coward. He told me years ago I was wasting my youth on a man who would never have the stomach for true power. We planned this, David. Greg and I planned everything. We set up the accounts. We filed the secondary injunctions. By tomorrow morning, the world is going to know that you embezzled client funds and ran away to escape federal prison. The paperwork is already in motion. You are going to be a fugitive, and I am going to be the tragic, abandoned wife who gets to keep everything. The words slammed into my brain one after another. Embezzlement, federal prison. Greg. Her brother Greg was a real estate developer I had loaned $50,000 to 3 years ago when he was on the verge of bankruptcy. I had saved his business, and now he and my wife had orchestrated my complete destruction. I finally found my voice. I yelled at her that she was insane. I told her she could not possibly get away with this. The money was locked. The escrow required my physical hardware key. I reached up and tapped my breast pocket, a desperate attempt to show her I still had leverage. I told her the transfer would never clear without the cryptographic key on my person. For a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossed her face. She looked at my pocket. She knew I was telling the truth. The signature was worthless without the hardware authentication. She needed that key. Give it to me, she demanded, dropping all pretense of calm. She lunged forward, her hands clawing at my jacket. I pushed her back, my mind racing in a state of pure panic. I looked toward the front of the cabin. The pilot, Jack. I had met him an hour ago on the tarmac. He seemed like a regular guy, a seasoned mountain pilot. I screamed his name. I yelled for him to turn the helicopter around. I yelled for him to radio the police. Jack did not turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon. His shoulders were rigid. His hands gripped the controls with a white-knuckled intensity. He was completely ignoring the struggle happening directly behind him. He was in on it. My mind fractured. Everyone was in on it. I was trapped in a glass and metal cage 3,000 feet in the air with two people who wanted me completely erased from existence. Rebecca lunged again. Her manicured nails dug into my chest, ripping the fabric of my jacket. She was screaming now, demanding the key, calling me a useless parasite. I fought back, gripping her wrists, trying to keep her away from my pocket. I was stronger than her, but the confined space of the chopper made it impossible to defend myself properly. Then, without warning, the helicopter banked violently to the right. The maneuver was so sharp and so sudden that the laws of gravity seemed to snap. Jack had thrown the cyclic stick hard to the side. The entire cabin tilted at a nauseating 60-degree angle. I was thrown completely off balance. My shoulder slammed into the side window. My grip on Rebecca's wrists broke. Before I could recover, I heard the sharp metallic click of my seatbelt releasing. Rebecca had timed it perfectly. While I was disoriented by the violent turn, she had reached down and punched the release button on my harness. I was no longer strapped in. I was floating weightless for a terrifying microsecond as the helicopter continued its aggressive bank. Then I heard the sound of the wind. It was a deafening, shrieking roar that instantly swallowed the noise of the engine. Rebecca had thrown the latch on the cabin door. The heavy door slid backward on its tracks, exposing the interior of the chopper to the brutal, freezing slipstream of the mountain air. The cold hit me like a solid wall of ice. The wind whipped through the cabin, tearing at my clothes, blinding me. I scrambled, desperately reaching for anything to hold on to. My fingers found the edge of the leather seat. I gripped it with every ounce of strength I possessed. My legs were already dangling out of the open doorway. Below me was nothing but a dizzying blur of white and green. Rebecca stood over me. The wind was whipping her blonde hair violently around her face, but she looked completely calm. She looked down at me as I hung halfway out of the helicopter, fighting for my life. She reached into my breast pocket. I could not stop her. If I let go of the seat, I would fall. I watched in helpless horror as her fingers grasped the small metal hardware key, but she fumbled. The violent shaking of the helicopter and the extreme force of the wind made her clumsy. The key slipped from her fingers. It bounced off my chest and landed on the metal floorboard right next to my left hand. Instinct took over. I let go of the seat with one hand and grabbed the key. I did not try to put it back in my pocket. I knew she would just pry it from my fingers. I brought my hand to my mouth, tilted my head back, and shoved the metal key past my teeth. I swallowed hard. It scraped violently down my throat, gagging me, tearing the delicate tissue, but it went down. It was inside me. The money was locked. Rebecca realized what I had done. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She screamed a curse that was instantly snatched away by the wind. She did not try to pull me back inside. She did not hesitate. She raised her heavy winter boot and planted it squarely on my chest. I looked into the eyes of the woman I had loved for 12 years. There was no hesitation. There was no remorse. There was only greed and absolute malice. She shoved her leg forward with all her might. My grip on the leather seat failed. My fingers slipped off the edge. The helicopter shot away from me instantly. 1 second I was inside the deafening roar of the machine, and the next second I was swallowed by an eerie, rushing silence. I was falling. The sensation was beyond terror. It was a complete overload of the human nervous system. The freezing air tore the breath from my lungs. I spun wildly, tumbling through the empty sky. The gray clouds above me spun into the white snow below me. I saw the black belly of the helicopter banking away, shrinking rapidly against the sky as it abandoned me to die. The pine canopy rushed up to meet me at a terrifying speed. I closed my eyes and braced for the end. I prayed it would be fast. I hit the trees. The impact was a catastrophic explosion of pain. Thick, frozen branches whipped and tore at my body, snapping like gunshots as my weight crashed through them. The canopy was dense, a tangled web of century-old pine trees. The branches did not stop my fall, but they slowed it. I was battered, shredded, and tossed from one massive limb to another. Every impact sent a shockwave of agony through my bones. I felt ribs crack. I felt skin tear. Then I hit the ground. The impact drove the remaining breath from my body in a wet gasp. A massive snowdrift piled deep in the bottom of a dark ravine swallowed me. The snow was soft enough to prevent my spine from shattering on the solid rock beneath, but the force of the landing knocked me completely unconscious. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was cast in the dim gray light of approaching twilight. The silence of the ravine was absolute. There was no wind down here. There was no sound of a helicopter. There was only the dripping of melting snow and the shallow, ragged sound of my own breathing. I tried to move and my body screamed in protest. Pain radiated from my chest, my legs, my arms. I tasted copper in my mouth. Blood. I was bleeding from a dozen different cuts. My suit jacket was shredded. The freezing cold was already seeping into my bones, turning my fingers numb. I lay there in the deep snow, staring up through the jagged hole I had broken through the tree canopy. The sky above was growing dark. I was miles away from civilization, severely injured and completely alone. My wife had just tried to murder me for $2 million. She was currently flying back to a warm house, preparing to tell the world that I was a criminal coward who had abandoned her. She thought she had won. She thought the ravine would be my grave. She thought the wilderness would swallow my body and my secrets forever. But as I lay there shivering uncontrollably, feeling the hard lump of the swallowed hardware key resting in my stomach, a different kind of cold washed over me. It was not the cold of the snow, it was the cold of absolute clarity. I was not dead yet. The fall had not killed me. The betrayal had not stopped my heart. I was broken. I was bleeding, and I was stranded at the bottom of the world. But I was still breathing. I forced my bloodied hands into the snow and began to drag myself forward. Every inch was a battle against unconsciousness. My ribs ground together with every breath. The freezing temperature was a ticking clock. If I did not find shelter, if I did not find a way out of this ravine, the winter night would finish the job my wife started. But I refused to die in the snow. I refused to let her inherit my life's work while my name was dragged through the mud. She pushed me out of that helicopter to silence me. But she made one critical mistake. She did not watch me hit the ground. The game was not over. It was just beginning. The cold was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a living, breathing entity trying to consume me. I lay buried at the bottom of the ravine, surrounded by a suffocating darkness. The hardware key I had swallowed sat like a burning stone in the pit of my stomach. Every time I tried to draw a breath, the broken ribs in my chest ground together with a sickening crunch. It was a brutal, agonizing reminder that the woman I loved had just tried to erase me from the face of the earth. I pushed my bloodied hands deep into the snow. My fingers were turning a pale, lifeless blue, rapidly losing their ability to feel anything at all. I knew the reality of my situation. If I stayed in that spot for another hour, my core temperature would drop past the point of no return. I would simply close my eyes, fall asleep, and never wake up. That was exactly what Rebecca was counting on. The thought of her sitting in our warm, luxurious living room, sipping expensive wine and waiting for the authorities to pronounce me legally dead, filled me with a sudden and violent surge of adrenaline. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a clean victory. I dragged my shattered body forward. I moved one excruciating inch at a time. The snow was deep, heavy, and completely unforgiving. My shredded suit jacket offered zero protection against the freezing mountain moisture. I used my elbows to pull my dead weight, kicking weakly with my legs to propel myself through the thick powder. Pain shot up my spine like electric shocks with every single movement. The mountain wilderness was completely silent and entirely indifferent to my suffering. I crawled over jagged rocks that were hidden beneath the snowdrifts. I dragged my face through thick patches of frozen pine brush that tore at my cheeks and forehead. Hours must have passed in that agonizing rhythm. The dim gray twilight slowly shifted into absolute pitch-black night. My vision began to blur. My mind started playing cruel tricks on me. I saw Rebecca standing in the trees just ahead of me, smiling that cold, mechanical smile she wore right before she pushed me. I blinked hard, and the hallucination vanished. I kept moving purely out of hatred and spite. Eventually, the steep incline of the ravine began to level out. The dense cluster of trees finally thinned. I felt the ground beneath the snow change from uneven rock to tightly packed dirt. I had found a logging road. It was narrow and completely unpaved, but it was a definitive sign of human life. I collapsed onto the freezing dirt, my face resting flat in the icy mud. I could not force my muscles to move another inch. My body had completely shut down its reserves. I lay there in the dark, waiting for my heart to stop beating. Then I heard it. The heavy grinding sound of a large diesel engine echoed through the trees. A pair of bright yellow headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, terrifying shadows across the forest floor. I tried to shout for help, but my throat was completely raw. I forced my heavy arm into the air, waving weakly into the glaring beams of light. The brakes of the truck screeched loudly. A heavy utility vehicle skidded to a halt just feet from my head. A large man jumped out of the driver's seat, yelling something I could not understand. He grabbed my shoulders and pulled me out of the mud. His hands felt like hot fire against my freezing skin. I closed my eyes and the world went completely black. I woke up to the strong chemical smell of liquid antiseptic and old linoleum flooring. The harsh glare of a fluorescent ceiling light pierced right through my eyelids. I groaned loudly and tried to turn my head. I was lying in a narrow, uncomfortable hospital bed in a small room covered in peeling green wallpaper. A clear plastic tube was taped to my arm, pumping warm saline fluids directly into my veins. My chest was tightly wrapped in thick medical bandages that restricted my breathing. Every single muscle in my body screamed in absolute agony. A nurse wearing faded blue scrubs was standing near the door writing notes on a plastic clipboard. She looked up immediately when she heard me move. She was an older woman with kind, tired eyes. She rushed over to the side of the bed, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder and telling me to stay completely still. She explained that I was in a rural county clinic on the very edge of the Cascade Mountains. She told me a local logger had found me half dead on the side of a dirt road. I was suffering from severe hypothermia, 3 fractured ribs, and multiple deep lacerations across my torso. I reached out and grabbed her wrist. My grip was incredibly weak, but my internal panic was absolute. I told her she needed to call the police right this second. I told her my wife had just tried to murder me in cold blood. My voice was nothing more than a hoarse, raspy whisper, but the pure desperation in my tone was impossible to ignore. The nurse looked down at me with a mixture of deep pity and sudden alarm. She gently peeled my cold fingers off her wrist and assured me that the county sheriff was already on his way. She said the clinic staff had to report the incident the exact moment the logger carried my bleeding body through their front doors. I fell back against the thin hospital pillow, panting heavily. The relief washing over me was overwhelming. I was finally safe. The proper authorities were getting involved. Rebecca was going to pay dearly for what she had done. I closed my eyes and imagined the state police showing up at our massive house, asking her questions she could not possibly answer, and tearing down her elaborate web of lies piece by piece. 20 minutes later, the heavy wooden door of the clinic room swung open. A tall, imposing man wearing a tan county sheriff uniform stepped inside the room. He had a thick gray mustache and a hard, completely unreadable expression on his weathered face. He rested his heavy right hand on his leather utility belt as he slowly approached my bed. The nurse quietly stepped out into the hallway, closing the door firmly behind her. I tried to sit up to greet him, but the sharp pain in my chest forced me right back down against the mattress. I started talking immediately, desperate to get the truth on the record. I told the sheriff my name was David. I told him all about the luxury helicopter charter we had booked. I told him about the $2 million corporate buyout, the pending escrow account, and the cryptographic hardware key I had swallowed to protect my assets. I described in graphic, horrifying detail how Rebecca had unbuckled my safety harness and shoved me out of the open cabin door while the pilot completely ignored my screams for help. I pleaded with him to contact the state police immediately and secure the flight records before they could cover their tracks. The sheriff did not take out a small notepad. He did not ask me any basic follow-up questions about the helicopter model or the exact location of the fall. He just stood there at the foot of my bed, staring at me with a cold, calculating gaze. When I finally stopped talking to catch my breath, he reached into his uniform breast pocket and pulled out a small black radio. He did not call for a major crime scene investigation. He pressed the button and asked his dispatch officer to confirm the identity on the active federal hold. My heart skipped a heavy beat. I asked him what he was doing and why he was not taking down my official statement. The sheriff looked down at me, his face completely devoid of any human sympathy. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his leather belt. The sharp metallic clink echoed loudly in the small, quiet clinic room. He told me to turn over and offer my wrists. I stared at the handcuffs in absolute paralyzing disbelief. I asked him what was going on and why he was treating me like a criminal. I told him I was the surviving victim of a vicious, premeditated murder attempt. The sheriff stepped forward and grabbed my left arm with a brutal grip that bruised my skin. He yanked my arm forward, completely ignoring my loud cries of pain as my broken ribs shifted under the bandages. He clamped the freezing cold steel around my left wrist and locked the other end tightly to the metal bed rail. I was physically trapped. A new kind of panic swelled thick in my throat, choking the air from my lungs. I begged him to listen to reason. I begged him to make a simple phone call to my corporate office or to anyone in my community who knew my character. The sheriff finally spoke, and his heavy words drained the remaining blood from my face. He told me he already knew exactly who I was. He said my wife, Rebecca, had filed an urgent missing person report early yesterday morning. She had walked into the local police station in absolute tears, claiming her husband had vanished in the middle of the night without leaving a single trace. But that was not all she had done while I was freezing in the snow. She had also filed a massive emergency injunction with the state court. She had provided the authorities with detailed bank records, internal company emails, and sworn client statements. According to the enormous stack of documents she handed over, I had aggressively embezzled $2 million from my own software clients over the past 6 months. The story she successfully fed the police was that I had recently discovered the corporate board of directors was launching a surprise financial audit. In a state of total panic, I supposedly drained the client accounts, packed a travel bag, and fled the city into the mountains to avoid a lengthy federal prosecution, my mind fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. The violent betrayal in the sky was only the physical part of her master plan. This was the true psychological execution. She had orchestrated my entire financial and legal destruction while I was lying broken at the bottom of a ravine. The internal emails she provided were obviously forged. The client statements were entirely fabricated. The banking records were expertly manipulated. And her brother Greg, the wealthy real estate developer with deep political connections, had undoubtedly helped her forge every single piece of that fake evidence. They had worked together to build a perfect, airtight narrative. If I had died in the mountain fall like they planned, I would be remembered forever as a disgraced, cowardly criminal who succumbed to the harsh elements while running from the law. She would inherit the clean company assets as the grieving, tragically betrayed widow, and everyone would offer her nothing but their deepest sympathies. And because I miraculously survived the fall, the situation was actually infinitely worse for me. The sheriff leaned over the bed and told me there was an active, high-priority warrant out for my immediate arrest regarding the missing $2 million. He said my wild story about being pushed out of a luxury helicopter sounded exactly like the desperate, drug-induced rambling of a guilty man trying to cover his tracks. The local authorities did not see a tragic victim lying in this hospital bed. They saw a dangerous fugitive who had gotten lost in the woods trying to escape the consequences of his own greed. Every single desperate word that came out of my mouth just made me look more guilty, more erratic, and more insane to the people who were supposed to protect me. I lay there securely chained to the metal bed frame, staring blankly at the peeling green wallpaper above me. The horrifying realization crashed over me like a massive tidal wave. I had absolutely no money to my name. I had no cellular phone to call a lawyer. My professional and personal reputation was completely destroyed by the woman I had trusted with my life. The full weight of the legal system was now firmly on her side. Rebecca had not just tried to kill my physical body. She had successfully assassinated my entire existence. I was 42 years old. I was a successful software founder who had spent 10 grueling years building a brilliant dream from nothing. And now I was a penniless, broken criminal handcuffed to a cheap medical bed in a remote town I did not even know. The elaborate trap had snapped entirely shut, leaving me with absolutely no way out and no one to turn to for help. The evil game she was playing was flawless in every single detail, but she did not know one crucial fact. She did not know that I had swallowed the only physical key to the money she so desperately wanted, and I was going to use it to destroy her. The transition from the sterile hospital clinic to the freezing concrete of the county jail happened in a blur of agonizing pain and blinding disbelief. I was still wearing the same shredded suit pants I had nearly died in. My chest was tightly wrapped in thick medical gauze, but every breath I took felt like a jagged knife twisting between my ribs. I sat on a thin metal bench inside a cramped holding cell, staring blankly at the iron bars in front of me. The air smelled of stale sweat and cheap industrial bleach. Less than 48 hours ago, I was sitting in a luxury helicopter celebrating a $2 million corporate buyout with the woman I loved. Now I was a caged animal. I was locked in a rural detention center, branded a fugitive and completely isolated from the world I had spent a decade building. The physical pain in my chest was nothing compared to the psychological torture tearing through my mind. Rebecca had planned this with terrifying precision. She had filed the emergency injunctions while I was bleeding in the snow. She had forged the banking documents. She had crafted a narrative so flawless that the local sheriff looked at me with absolute disgust instead of pity. I was not a victim in the eyes of the law. I was a cowardly criminal who had drained his own clients' accounts and fled to the mountains to escape federal prison. She had built a perfect cage of lies, and I was trapped right in the middle of it. A heavy-set deputy with a bored expression walked down the narrow corridor and stopped in front of my cell. He unlocked the heavy iron door with a loud metallic clink that echoed off the concrete walls. He told me I was allowed one phone call before the state transport arrived to take me to the federal holding facility. One call. That was all I had to reach the outside world. I stood up slowly, clutching my bruised ribs, and followed him down the hallway to a small room with a metal telephone bolted to the wall. My hands shook as I picked up the heavy plastic receiver. I did not call a criminal defense attorney. I did not call the corporate board of directors at my software firm. I knew Rebecca and her brother Greg had already poisoned those wells. The board would be looking at the forged embezzlement documents, believing I had ruined the company. An attorney would demand a massive retainer fee that I could not possibly pay with frozen accounts. I needed someone who knew my character. I needed someone who had seen my soul, someone who would listen to my voice and immediately know that I was incapable of the horrific crimes I was being accused of. I dialed the personal cell phone number of Pastor Thomas Miller. Thomas was not just the head of the massive community church Rebecca and I had attended for 15 years. He was my spiritual mentor. He was the man who had baptized me. He was the man who had counseled us through our early marital struggles. When I launched my software company from a tiny guest bedroom, Thomas was the one who came over and prayed over my desk, asking for guidance and integrity in my business. I had donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to his community outreach programs over the years. I trusted him implicitly. If there was one man on this entire earth who could cut through Rebecca's lies and rally the community to help me post bail, it was Thomas. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. His voice was deep and familiar, a sound that immediately brought a desperate rush of tears to my eyes. "David," he said. His tone was not warm. It was heavy, flat, and completely devoid of the paternal affection I had relied on for over a decade. "Thomas." I gasped into the receiver, my voice cracking under the weight of my panic. "Thank God you answered. Thomas, you have to listen to me. I am locked in a county holding cell near the Cascade Mountains. Rebecca is trying to kill me. She pushed me out of a helicopter. She forged documents claiming I embezzled company funds, but it is a lie. It is all a massive lie. You know me, Thomas. You know I would never steal. I need your help. I need you to contact the police and tell them who I really am. I need you to help me get bail before they transfer me to a federal prison." I waited for his shock. I waited for him to express outrage, to tell me he was getting in his car right that second to promise me that the church would stand behind me. Instead, a long, suffocating silence stretched across the telephone line. The silence was so deep and so profound that I thought the call had dropped. "Thomas," I whispered, gripping the metal cord of the telephone so hard my knuckles turned white. "Are you there?" "I am here, David," he finally replied. His voice was ice cold. "And I am sick to my stomach just hearing your voice." The words felt like a physical blow to my jaw. I stumbled back slightly, leaning my shoulder against the cinder block wall to keep myself from collapsing. I asked him what he meant. I begged him to explain. "Do not play the victim with me, David," Thomas said, his voice rising with a righteous anger that made my blood run entirely cold. "Rebecca came to the church yesterday morning. She was completely broken. She was weeping uncontrollably in my office, terrified for her life and terrified for the community. She brought the police detectives with her, and she brought the audio recordings." My breath caught in my throat. Audio recordings. I asked him what audio recordings he was talking about. "The recordings of you confessing Thomas," said, his words striking me like a hammer. "The recordings of you screaming at her in your living room admitting that you gambled away the $2 million in client funds. The recordings where you threatened to hurt her if she ever told the authorities about your hidden offshore accounts. She played them for me, David. She played them for the entire congregation during the evening service last night. We all heard your voice. We all heard the vile, disgusting things you said to the woman you promised to love and protect." The room started spinning. The small concrete walls of the phone booth seemed to close in on me. Audio recordings. Rebecca and Greg had not just forged bank statements. They had fabricated my own voice. They had likely used the massive trove of video interviews, podcast appearances, and corporate keynote speeches I had recorded over the years to feed my voice into an artificial intelligence generator. They had engineered a flawless, undeniable fake confession, and they had played it in front of the very people I loved and trusted the most. Thomas. That was not me. I pleaded, the desperation tearing my throat raw. "It is a fabrication. Greg has political connections and endless resources. They faked the audio. You know my character. You know I have never gambled a day in my life. You have known me for 15 years. I thought I knew you." Thomas interrupted, his tone shifting from anger to absolute disgust. "But the man I heard on those tapes was a monster. You stole from the people who trusted you. You drained the life savings of your own clients to feed your sick addictions, and then you ran like a coward when the audit was announced. Rebecca is a saint for covering for you as long as she did. The church has completely rallied around her. We have established a secure fund to help her pay for the legal fallout you caused. You are no longer welcome in our congregation, David. Do not ever call this number again." The line went dead. A sharp dial tone buzzed in my ear, matching the frantic buzzing in my own brain. I slowly lowered the heavy plastic receiver back onto its metal cradle. My hands were entirely numb. My chest heaved as I struggled to pull oxygen into my lungs. The physical pain of my broken ribs was completely eclipsed by the agonizing reality of what had just happened. The smear campaign was absolute. Rebecca had not just attacked my bank accounts. She had surgically assassinated my character in the one place where I thought I was untouchable. She had weaponized my own community against me. The people I had prayed with, the families I had shared meals with, the pastor I had confided my deepest fears to, they all believed I was a dangerous, abusive, thieving addict. She had played the grieving, terrified victim so perfectly that my destruction was complete. I was entirely isolated. I had no friends left. I had no community left. I was completely alone in the world. The heavy-set deputy tapped his metal baton against the doorframe, signaling that my time was up. I did not speak as he escorted me back to the cold holding cell. I sat on the metal bench, staring at the concrete floor, my mind completely blank. The shock was so profound that I could not even cry. The evil brilliance of Rebecca's plan was paralyzing. She knew that if I somehow miraculously survived the fall from the helicopter, no one would ever believe my story. I was a discredited, disgraced fugitive. My truth meant absolutely nothing. I sat in that cell for 6 hours, waiting for the federal transport bus to arrive and take me away forever. I braced myself for the reality of federal prison, but then the heavy iron door clanked open again. A different officer, an older man with a clipboard, stepped into the corridor. He called my last name and told me to step up to the bars. I slowly walked forward, gripping the cold steel. He flipped through several pages on his clipboard, frowning in deep confusion. "Pack your belongings," he grunted, not looking up from the paperwork. "You are being released on a temporary county bond." I stared at him, my brain struggling to process his words. Released. I asked him how that was possible. I asked him about the massive federal warrant for the $2 million in missing funds. The officer sighed, looking highly annoyed by the administrative chaos. "The federal warrant is caught up in a jurisdictional delay," he explained coldly. "The corporate accounts are registered in a different state, and the federal prosecutor has not officially stamped the extradition paperwork yet. The county judge here cannot legally hold you on a pending out-of-state federal charge without the physical mandate. So the judge granted a standard county bail for the local disturbance, and someone just posted it anonymously through a third-party bondsman. You have 48 hours before the federal mandate drops, and they come looking for you again. But for now, you are walking out that door." My mind raced. Someone posted my bail anonymously. Who could possibly know where I was and who would be willing to pay for my release? It certainly was not Pastor Thomas. It was not my corporate board. The terrifying truth hit me instantly. It was Greg. Rebecca's brother knew the federal delay was happening. He paid the local bondsman because he wanted me out on the streets. He wanted me vulnerable, exposed, and entirely unprotected by the walls of the county jail. They processed my release in total silence. The property clerk handed me a clear plastic bag containing the items they had stripped from me when I arrived from the clinic. My shredded suit jacket, my ruined leather dress shoes, a bloody torn undershirt, and my wallet. I walked out of the double-glass doors of the county detention center and stepped into the freezing mountain air. The sky was dark gray, promising a heavy winter storm. I stood on the concrete sidewalk, shivering violently in my torn clothes. My ribs screamed in pain with every slight movement. I opened my leather wallet with shaking fingers. I pulled out my corporate credit card and my personal debit card. I walked 3 blocks down the street to a small, dirty gas station with an ATM glowing in the window. I slid my personal debit card into the machine and typed in my PIN number. I just needed enough cash to buy a cheap winter coat and a bus ticket to a larger city where I could disappear. The digital screen flashed red. Account frozen. Contact your financial institution. I cursed under my breath and pulled out the corporate credit card. I slid it into the machine. A different red message appeared. Card terminated due to suspected fraud. I stood there in the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station, the cold wind whipping right through my thin, torn shirt. The reality of my situation crushed down on me like a collapsing building. The release from the jail was not a stroke of luck. It was the next phase of their torture. They had frozen every single account I owned. They had cut off every line of credit. I did not have a single dollar to my name. I was standing in a strange, freezing town with broken ribs, no money, no phone, and a federal arrest warrant that was going to drop in exactly 48 hours. They had pushed me out of the helicopter to kill my body. They had used the church and the fake audio to kill my reputation. And now they had stripped me of my finances to ensure I could not fight back. I was completely destitute. I was at the absolute rock bottom of human existence, staring at a plastic ATM screen that told me I was worth zero. But as I stood there shivering in the cold, feeling the hard metallic lump of the cryptographic hardware key resting deep inside my stomach, a dark, dangerous determination began to burn in my chest. They had taken my company. They had taken my wife. They had taken my reputation and my faith. But they had not taken the key. The $2 million was still locked in escrow, and it would stay locked until I decided otherwise. The game was far from over. I pulled my shredded suit jacket tighter around my shoulders and walked out into the freezing storm, ready to face whatever trap they had set for me next. The freezing wind howling through the mountain town felt like tiny, jagged shards of glass cutting directly into my exposed skin. I stood outside the dirty glass doors of the gas station, staring at the plastic ATM card resting in my trembling, blood-stained hand. My personal accounts were completely locked. My corporate credit lines were entirely destroyed. I was 42 years old, a man who had sacrificed 10 grueling years of his life to build a $2 million software enterprise from absolutely nothing, and I could not even afford a single cup of hot coffee to warm my numb fingers. Every time I tried to take a shallow breath, the fractured ribs in my chest ground against each other with a sickening crunch, sending blinding flashes of physical agony straight into my brain. I pulled my shredded, ruined suit jacket tightly across my chest and limped away from the harsh fluorescent lights of the station. I needed a lifeline immediately. I needed someone who owed me, someone who understood the fundamental value of loyalty and debt. My racing mind immediately went to Greg. Rebecca's older brother was a highly connected luxury real estate developer who operated out of downtown Seattle. 3 years ago, his massive development firm was on the brink of total catastrophic bankruptcy due to a massive commercial zoning lawsuit. He had come to my house in the middle of the night, visibly shaking, crying uncontrollably on my living room couch, and begging for a personal loan to keep his desperate contractors from walking off the job. I did not consult my financial advisors. I did not ask him to sign a humiliating collateral agreement. I simply wrote him a personal check for $50,000 and told him to pay me back whenever he finally found his footing. He had grabbed my hand, looked me dead in the eye, and sworn on his own life that he would never forget what I did for him. Now I desperately needed him to remember that promise. I found a rusted graffiti-covered public payphone attached to the brick wall outside a closed laundromat 2 blocks down the street. I fumbled frantically in my wet pockets and miraculously found 3 damp quarters resting in the lining of my jacket. I fed them into the cold metal machine and dialed his private cellular number entirely from memory. It rang 4 agonizing times. I closed my eyes and prayed to God he would answer. I prayed with every fiber of my being that he was not a part of the evil nightmare his sister had just orchestrated. The line clicked open with a sharp burst of static. David, Gregg said. His voice was incredibly smooth and surprisingly calm. There was no sudden shock in his tone. There was no confusion or panic about hearing from a man who was currently supposed to be a highly dangerous federal fugitive. Gregg, I whispered, leaning my bruised forehead against the freezing metal of the payphone enclosure. I need your help right now. Rebecca has completely lost her mind. She tried to murder me, Gregg. She pushed me out of a flying helicopter and framed me for embezzling my own corporate funds. My accounts are totally frozen. I have absolutely nothing left. I expected him to sound horrified. I expected him to demand to know exactly where I was so he could get in his car and come rescue me. Instead, he let out a long, slow, terrifyingly patient breath over the receiver. I already know exactly where you are, David, he replied, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy. I am the one who paid the local bondsman to get you out of that county holding cell anonymously. I am currently about 20 minutes outside of your jurisdiction. There is a small rundown diner on Highway 9 called the Rusty Anchor. Meet me there in exactly half an hour. We need to have a very serious conversation about your immediate future. The line went completely dead. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver, my fractured mind spinning with a fragile, desperate sense of relief. Gregg had paid my bail. He knew the truth about what Rebecca had done, or at least he was willing to sit down and hear my side of the story. I started walking toward the rural edge of town, dragging my left leg slightly as the deep muscle contusions from my terrifying mountain fall began to stiffen aggressively in the dropping temperature. Highway 9 was a desolate, pitch-black stretch of cracked asphalt surrounded by towering, oppressive pine trees. The winter rain started to fall again, a freezing, miserable drizzle that soaked right through my thin, torn undershirt. By the time I finally saw the flickering, glowing neon sign of the Rusty Anchor shining through the fog, I was shivering so violently I could barely keep my teeth from chattering. The diner was a forgotten, depressing relic of a bygone era. The cracked pavement of the parking lot was completely empty except for an old rusted pickup truck and a sleek, immaculate black Mercedes sedan parked illegally right by the front door. The visual contrast between that luxury vehicle and the decaying building was physically sickening. I pushed open the heavy glass door with my shoulder. A small brass bell above my head chimed weakly, announcing my arrival. The warm air inside smelled heavily of stale frying oil, harsh chemical floor bleach, and old cigarette smoke. The waitress standing behind the laminate counter barely even looked up from her faded magazine as I dragged my broken body past her station. I spotted Greg sitting in a cracked vinyl booth at the very back of the empty restaurant. He was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit, an expensive silver silk tie, and a heavy gold watch that caught the dim, flickering overhead light. He looked exactly like a man who believed he owned the entire world. But he was not sitting there alone. Sitting directly across from him was a sharp-featured older man, wearing thin wire-rimmed glasses and resting his hand on a thick leather briefcase. I approached the table slowly, my soaking wet dress shoes squeaking loudly and pathetically against the cheap checkered linoleum floor. Greg looked up from his mug of black coffee. He did not smile at me. He did not offer to shake my hand. He simply gestured with complete indifference to the empty space on the vinyl bench right next to the stranger. "Sit down, David," Greg said softly, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You look absolutely terrible." I slid into the booth with immense difficulty, grimacing in pain as the awkward movement violently pulled at my torn abdominal muscles. I looked at the man beside me and asked Greg exactly who this stranger was. "This is my personal corporate attorney, Mr. Harrison," Greg explained casually, waving his hand dismissively. "He handles all of my high-level financial risk management. And right now, David, you are an incredibly high-level risk to my family." I stared at him, my fragile, desperate hope instantly shattering into a million jagged pieces. The absolute chilling calm in his voice was terrifying. I leaned forward, fighting through the pain in my chest, and reminded him about the $50,000 I had willingly given him when he was crying like a helpless child on my living room floor. I told him he owed me his entire professional career. Greg laughed. It was a cold, hollow, metallic sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "I do not owe you a single thing," he said, his eyes narrowing with sudden vicious hatred. "You only gave me that money because you desperately wanted to feel superior to me. You always loved playing the righteous savior, David. You loved looking down on me from your pristine little software throne while I struggled in the dirt. But the truth is, you were always a soft, pathetic, bleeding heart coward." Rebecca finally saw it. I always saw it. You were never built to survive in the real world with real predators. I asked him if he had any idea what Rebecca had actually done to me. I asked him if he knew she had physically unbuckled my safety harness and kicked me out of a flying helicopter into a deadly mountain ravine just to steal my life's work. Greg did not even blink. "Of course I know, David," he replied, his tone as casual as if we were discussing a minor business transaction. "Who exactly do you think hired that specific pilot? Who do you think spent the last 6 months expertly forging those bank statements and fabricating those client emails? Rebecca is a highly ambitious woman, but she certainly does not have the strategic, calculating mind required for a federal wire fraud operation. I built this entire narrative from the ground up. I set the trap perfectly. We just needed you to disappear permanently in those mountains, so the federal investigators would close the embezzlement case with a neat, tragic, unquestionable bow. You miraculously surviving that fall was a very unfortunate statistical anomaly that we are now fixing." My blood ran completely cold in my veins. The depth of the betrayal was so immense it felt like an actual physical weight crushing the remaining oxygen from my lungs. My own wife and my brother-in-law had actively, meticulously planned my violent execution just to steal my corporate buyout money. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, finally spoke. He did not look at my face. He just reached his pale hand into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope. He slid it slowly across the sticky table until it rested directly in front of my bruised hands. "Inside that envelope is a one-way commercial bus ticket to Los Angeles," the lawyer said in a monotonous, highly practiced robotic voice. "There is also exactly $500 in untraceable small denomination cash. You are going to take that envelope right now, Mr. Morrison. You are going to walk out of this diner board the midnight transit bus, and you are never going to contact anyone in this state ever again. If you try to fight us, the jurisdictional delay on your federal warrant will magically resolve itself tomorrow morning, and you will spend the rest of your natural life rotting in a maximum security federal prison for stealing $2 million from your own clients." I stared down at the plain white envelope. $500. They were offering me $500 in cheap cash in exchange for a $2 million enterprise, my spotless reputation, and my entire human identity. I looked up at Greg, my vision blurring slightly with absolute, unadulterated rage. I asked him what would happen if I simply refused their disgusting offer. I told him the truth always eventually comes out. Greg smiled, revealing perfectly white, incredibly expensive teeth. "If you refuse, I'm going to walk out to my beautiful car right now, dial the local police dispatcher, and tell them my highly dangerous, mentally unstable fugitive brother-in-law just ambushed me in a dark diner and threatened to stab me to death if I did not empty my wallet. I have a highly respected, heavily compensated lawyer sitting right here who will swear under oath that he saw the deadly weapon in your hand. You will not just be going down for a white-collar embezzlement charge, David. You will be going down for armed robbery and aggravated assault. You have absolutely zero legal or financial leverage here. Take the cash. Run away tonight. Start over as a penniless nobody. It is exactly what you have always been anyway." I sat there in the dim, flickering light of the diner, listening to the winter rain violently lash against the thin glass window pane. My entire broken body ached with a profound, agonizing physical pain that paled in comparison to the fire burning in my chest. I looked at the crisp envelope sitting on the table. It represented total cowardly surrender. It was the final defining nail in the coffin of my existence. I slowly reached out with my bruised, violently shaking hand and picked up the envelope. Greg nodded with deep, arrogant satisfaction, leaning back confidently against the vinyl booth. "I always knew you were a spineless coward," he sneered, picking up his coffee mug. "Have a nice life, David. Try not to freeze to death on your way to the bus station." I gripped the paper envelope tightly, but I did not slide out of the booth. I looked directly into Greg's cold eyes, dropping my voice to a dead, terrifying whisper that made the lawyer shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I am taking this cash because you owe me $50,000. I said, slowly emphasizing every single syllable. "Consider this the very first installment of your outstanding debt. But I am not getting on that midnight bus, Greg. I am not running away from my own life. You and Rebecca think you have won this game because you control the fake narrative. But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation. You tried to murder a man who now has absolutely nothing left to lose." I slid out of the booth and stood up, towering over their table despite my broken ribs screaming in protest. "I am going to tear your entire comfortable life apart piece by piece," I promised him, my voice completely steady. "And when I am finally done, you are going to beg me for the exact same mercy you just denied me." I turned my back on their shocked silence and walked out of the diner before either of them could formulate a response. The small bell chimed weakly again as I pushed through the glass door and stepped back into the freezing, relentless storm. The rain was coming down in heavy, blinding sheets now. I walked past Greg's pristine black Mercedes, heading toward the dark, narrow, garbage-filled alleyway that led back to the main highway. The freezing water soaked my hair and ran down my face, washing away the dried blood from the mountain fall. I clutched the envelope against my chest, frantically calculating my next move. $500 was just enough to buy a cheap prepaid burner phone and a warm winter coat. It was just enough resources to start hunting them down and exploiting the hardware key they did not know I had swallowed. But as I reached the deepest, darkest, most isolated part of the brick alleyway, a massive, heavy shadow detached itself from the side of a rusted metal dumpster. Before my exhausted brain could even react, a massive, calloused hand grabbed the collar of my torn suit jacket. A solid, brutal fist slammed directly into my fractured ribs with the force of a speeding truck. The impact was so utterly explosive that all the remaining air rushed out of my lungs in a wet, pathetic gasp. I collapsed instantly onto the freezing wet asphalt, clutching my shattered chest in absolute blinding agony. A second man stepped out of the freezing rain wearing heavy steel-toed work boots and a dark rain slicker. They did not say a single word to me. They did not demand answers. They simply kicked me over and over again with ruthless mechanical precision, intentionally targeting my soft stomach, my exposed back, and my already damaged legs. I curled my body into a tight defensive ball, trying desperately to protect my head, but I was far too weak and broken to fight back against the assault. One of the men reached down with a rough hand and violently yanked the white envelope from my frozen, slipping fingers. He shoved the money deep into his coat pocket, spat a thick wad of saliva onto the ground right next to my bleeding face, and disappeared completely into the howling storm with his silent partner. They had been waiting out here in the dark for me the entire time. Greg never had any intention of letting me keep that pathetic amount of money. He just wanted to humiliate me, give me a fleeting second of hope, and then break me completely in the mud. I lay there bleeding heavily in the freezing rain, staring up at the pitch-black, unforgiving sky above me, finally realizing that the brutal war for my life and my name had only just begun. The winter rain did not stop for 3 consecutive days. It fell in heavy, freezing sheets that soaked right through my ruined thin shirt and turned the cracked city pavement into a dark, icy mirror. I found my only shelter inside a rusted, abandoned station wagon parked behind a decaying strip mall on the absolute desolate outskirts of Seattle. The vehicle was a tomb of forgotten trash. The windows were entirely shattered, allowing the bitter wind to howl through the cabin. The back seats smelled sharply of black mold, decayed autumn leaves, and old motor oil. But it kept the relentless freezing water from hitting my skin directly. I curled my shattered, broken body across the damp, torn upholstery, trying to make myself as small as physically possible. Every single breath I drew was a brutal, agonizing negotiation with pain. My fractured ribs throbbed with a hot, sickening rhythm that made it impossible to find any rest. The deep, jagged lacerations across my chest and arms, carved into my flesh by the mountain pine trees during my terrifying fall, were highly inflamed and angry. I had no medical bandages. I had no access to antibiotics. I had absolutely nothing. I was a 42-year-old man who had spent a decade building a massive regional software empire from scratch, and now I was shivering violently in a pile of urban garbage, listening to the rain hammer against a metal roof. Extreme hunger was a constant gnawing ache deep in my stomach, twisting my insides until I felt constantly nauseous. I had not eaten a real solid meal since the morning of the helicopter flight back when I thought my life was perfect. The $500 my brother-in-law Greg had mockingly offered me was gone, violently stolen by the 2 thugs he had hired to beat me in the dark alleyway. I was effectively a ghost. I was haunting the cold edges of a massive city that did not care if I lived or died. I spent the endless dark hours staring up at the torn fabric of the car ceiling, trying to intellectually process the sheer magnitude of my total destruction. Rebecca had meticulously taken my home, my company, my bank accounts, and my professional reputation. She had successfully turned my pastor, my community, and the entire legal world against me. I was entirely erased. When the sun finally began to rise on the 4th miserable day, the torrential rain slowed to a heavy gray drizzle. I forced my battered body to crawl out of the station wagon. My legs trembled so violently that I had to lean all my weight against the rusted car door just to stay standing upright. The deep, penetrating cold had settled permanently into my bones, making my joints stiff and highly unresponsive. I knew with terrifying absolute certainty that if I stayed in that abandoned car for another freezing night, my body would simply give out. The infection rapidly spreading through my untreated cuts would easily finish the job that the freezing mountain temperature had started. I dragged my ruined dress shoes down the cracked concrete sidewalk, heading blindly toward the commercial downtown district. I kept my chin tucked down into my collar, desperately hiding my severely bruised and swollen face from the few morning pedestrians rushing past me. They carried warm umbrellas and held steaming cups of expensive coffee. They looked right through me with casual indifference. To them, I was just another broken piece of the tragic urban landscape to be avoided. They had absolutely no idea that just a few days ago I used to sit at the head of massive glass boardrooms and successfully negotiate million-dollar corporate contracts. I walked for over 2 miles, moving entirely on raw adrenaline and deep burning spite. My lungs burned with every step. I eventually stopped walking when I found myself standing in front of a massive retail electronics store. The bright, harsh fluorescent lights from inside the showroom spilled out warmly onto the wet gray pavement. An entire impressive wall of massive flat-screen televisions faced the street, displaying the morning news broadcast on a silent, synchronized loop. I leaned my exhausted, aching shoulder heavily against the freezing glass of the display window, trying desperately to absorb some of the residual heat radiating from the large building. I closed my eyes for just a brief moment, praying silently for a single stroke of luck to keep me moving forward. When I slowly opened my eyes and looked up at the glowing digital screens, my heart stopped completely dead in my chest. The major local news channel was running a highly promoted special morning segment, and sitting right there in the very center of the expensive broadcast studio, bathed in bright television lighting, was my wife. Rebecca looked absolutely devastating. She was expertly wearing a simple conservative black dress that made her look incredibly fragile and deeply vulnerable. Her perfect blonde hair was pulled back neatly into a modest clip, a stark contrast to her usual glamorous style. She was sitting directly across from a highly sympathetic veteran news anchor, nervously holding a crumpled white tissue in her perfectly manicured hands. The bold breaking news caption scrolling across the bottom of the television screen read, "Betrayed by greed. A devastated wife speaks out." I stared through the thick storefront glass, entirely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic audacity of the woman who had literally kicked me out of a flying helicopter. Although I could not hear the audio feed through the heavy window pane, the visual narrative she was weaving was incredibly clear. The news station flashed several heavily edited dramatic graphics showing the missing $2 million from my corporate ledgers. They displayed an awful, shadowy photo of my face, intentionally making me look like a dangerous corporate criminal on the run. Then the camera quickly cut back to Rebecca's face. I watched her wipe a single, perfectly timed tear from her pale cheek. She was playing the role of the traumatized, emotionally abandoned victim with absolute Oscar-winning precision. The television broadcast seamlessly transitioned to show a bright web page she had recently launched. It was a massive public crowdfunding campaign. She had actually taken the time to set up a donation page, falsely claiming she was left entirely destitute and terrified by my sudden criminal disappearance. The digital screen proudly displayed a rising progress bar showing that her campaign had already raised over $80,000 from highly sympathetic community members, church congregation friends, and former business partners. People I had known and trusted for over a decade were willingly giving her their hard-earned money because they truly thought I had violently ruined her innocent life. She was actively profiting from my supposed betrayal. But the final part of the news segment was by far the most sickening. The news anchor solemnly held up a legal document stamped with a bright red corporate seal. The bold text flashing on the screen announced that the massive $2 million software buyout I had spent months negotiating was moving rapidly into the final stages of legal clearance. Rebecca had aggressively filed the necessary emergency court paperwork to legally bypass my required signature due to my active federal fugitive status. She was legally positioning her newly formed holding company to absorb the entire massive escrow account by the end of the business week. She was going to steal the company money, keep the sympathy donations, and happily watch me rot away in the dark shadows. I watched her smile sadly directly into the camera lens, humbly asking the viewing public for their continued thoughts and prayers during her difficult time. I backed away from the glass storefront window, my chest heaving violently as a hot, blinding surge of pure rage flooded my entire nervous system. The intense anger was so completely overwhelming that it actually pushed right through the agonizing physical pain in my fractured ribs. She truly thought she was totally invincible. She firmly thought her brother Greg had perfectly secured every single angle of their highly elaborate master plan. She arrogantly believed I was either lying dead in the remote mountain wilderness or hiding like a terrified coward in the city gutters, completely powerless to stop her hostile takeover. She was gleefully counting the remaining hours until the National Bank officially released those massive funds directly into her private offshore accounts. But as I stood there shivering in the freezing morning rain, a sudden powerful electric realization struck my brain. It hit me so incredibly hard that I actually gasped out loud, a sound that startled a passing businessman. The massive $2 million corporate buyout was absolutely not a standard simple bank transfer. It was a highly secure restricted escrow release, built entirely on strict cryptographic protocols. During the grueling final stages of the corporate negotiations, the buying company's board of directors had adamantly insisted on military-grade digital authentication to prevent any possibility of wire fraud. That massive sum of money could not magically be released by a simple forged signature or a local judge granting a default court order. The entire transaction fundamentally required a physical secondary authentication process at the terminal. It required my proprietary hardware key. I reached down with my trembling fingers and pressed my cold hand against my torn jacket pocket. I vividly remembered the chaotic, highly violent physical struggle inside the tiny helicopter cabin. I remembered Rebecca viciously clawing at my chest, desperately trying to steal the small metal security device from my person. And I remembered the look of absolute unadulterated panic flashing across her face when I shoved that metal key deep into my mouth and swallowed it whole right before she viciously kicked me out the open door into the sky. That specific hardware key was constructed of surgical-grade titanium casing. It was expertly designed to easily withstand extreme environmental pressure and severe physical damage. And just 2 days ago, while I was slowly recovering in the desolate frozen woods before I finally reached the rural logging town, human biology had taken its inevitable natural course. I had endured a highly agonizing, severely humiliating physical process alone in the freezing pine brush to successfully recover that device. I had scrubbed it clean in a freezing, rushing mountain stream until my bare hands were entirely numb and raw. I now had that tiny, virtually indestructible piece of metal securely wrapped tightly in a torn piece of cotton fabric, safely tucked deep inside the sole of my left shoe. Rebecca did not possess the authentication key. Her powerful brother Greg did not have the key. The federal bank did not have the key. And without that highly specific physical device inserting its unique encrypted cryptographic signature into the bank's escrow terminal, the entire $2 million transfer would remain permanently frozen in digital limbo. The bank manager could not override the system. The federal court could not legally bypass the strict security parameters. The money was completely and totally trapped in a secure digital vault, and I was literally the only person on the entire planet holding the combination to unlock it. The heavy, suffocating despair that had been aggressively crushing my soul for the past 4 days instantly evaporated into the cold city air. I was no longer a helpless, tragic victim. I was no longer a broken, defeated man waiting to quietly die in the back of an abandoned car. I was the silent architect of their impending total destruction. Rebecca was sitting comfortably on national television, crying fake calculated tears and eagerly counting millions of dollars she did not actually possess. She had absolutely no idea that the massive fortune she had eagerly committed attempted murder for was completely inaccessible to her. She had no earthly idea that the man she violently pushed into a deadly ravine was currently standing on a downtown city street holding the literal and figurative key to her entire future. I turned away from the glowing electronics store window and began walking back down the wet, crowded sidewalk. My broken ribs still screamed in protest with every movement. My legs still ached with a deep, throbbing exhaustion. I was still completely homeless, starving, and entirely penniless. But the fundamental narrative of my life had violently shifted. They had ruthlessly stripped me of my home, my family, and my respected name. But they had tragically failed to take my ultimate leverage. I desperately needed to find a secure phone. I needed to formulate a plan to track down the helicopter pilot who had watched the whole thing happen. The hunted prey was officially about to become the relentless hunter. The deadly game was fully locked, and it was finally my turn to dictate the rules. The downtown public library opened its heavy glass doors at exactly 8 in the morning. I was the first person to slip inside, blending in with a small group of university students and elderly patrons seeking refuge from the bitter cold. The heated air of the building hit my face like a physical blow, making my freezing skin sting violently. I kept my head tucked low, hiding my deeply bruised face behind the raised collar of my ruined, dirty suit jacket. Every single step I took sent a sharp, agonizing shockwave through my fractured ribs, reminding me of the terrifying fall from the sky. I needed to move quickly and quietly. I was a wanted federal fugitive standing in a highly public government building. If anyone recognized my face from the local news broadcasts, I would be in handcuffs within 10 minutes. I walked past the main circulation desk and found a secluded row of public computer terminals tucked away in the back corner of the reference section. I sat down heavily in a plastic chair, wincing as my torn muscles stretched. I had exactly 1 hour of complimentary internet access before the system required a registered library card. I did not have a second to waste. I closed my eyes and forced my traumatized brain to mentally travel back to that deafening, freezing helicopter cabin. I needed a name. I needed the identity of the man sitting in the pilot seat who had completely ignored my desperate screams for help while my wife pushed me to my death. I recalled the vivid blue and white logo painted on the side of the helicopter door. Cascade Peak Aviation. I opened my eyes, placed my trembling fingers on the plastic keyboard, and typed the name into the search engine. The screen immediately populated with corporate directories and regional flight logs. I bypassed the main corporate website and dug directly into the independent contractor registries. I spent 30 agonizing minutes cross-referencing flight schedules with licensed mountain pilots in the Pacific Northwest region. Finally, I found a matching profile. His name was Jack Reynolds. He was a veteran mountain rescue pilot who currently operated out of a private, highly secluded rural airstrip located 40 miles north of the city limits. The registry listed a physical address for his personal hangar. I stared at the glowing digital screen burning the exact coordinates into my memory. I did not have a vehicle. I did not have a mobile phone. I had absolutely no money to pay for transportation. But I had a target and I was going to hunt him down. The journey to the remote airfield was a grueling test of human endurance. I walked for 2 miles until I reached a massive industrial truck stop on the outer edge of the city limits. I hid behind a row of overflowing trash dumpsters waiting for the perfect opportunity. When a heavy diesel logging truck pulled up to the fueling pumps, the driver stepped out and walked inside the convenience store to buy coffee. I seized my chance. I sprinted across the oily asphalt, fighting through the blinding pain in my chest, and climbed over the metal tailgate into the open cargo bed of the truck. I buried myself deep under a heavy, foul-smelling canvas tarp just seconds before the driver returned. The ensuing ride lasted for over an hour, and it was absolute physical torture. The massive truck bounced violently over every single pothole on the rural highway, tossing my broken body against the hard metal floorboard. I bit down hard on my own sleeve to keep from screaming out in pain. When the truck finally slowed down to navigate a sharp turn near an isolated logging road, I threw back the canvas tarp and rolled out of the moving vehicle. I hit the muddy shoulder of the road hard, tumbling into a deep ditch filled with freezing rainwater. I lay there in the mud for several minutes, gasping for air, waiting for the red taillights of the truck to disappear completely into the dense fog. I dragged myself out of the ditch and began the final phase of my journey on foot. I walked for 3 miles down a cracked, overgrown asphalt road surrounded by towering, oppressive pine trees. The winter sun was rapidly setting, casting long, terrifying shadows across the desolate landscape. The rural airstrip was completely isolated from civilization. It consisted of a single deeply weathered runway and a massive corrugated metal hangar sitting alone at the edge of the dark forest. There were no security cameras. There were no perimeter fences. It was the perfect place for a man to hide. I crept through the tall, dead winter grass, keeping my body crouched low to the ground. I approached the side of the metal hangar and pressed my ear against the cold aluminum siding. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of classical music playing from a cheap radio inside. I found a small side door that was left slightly ajar. I slipped through the narrow opening and stepped into the dim interior. The hangar smelled overwhelmingly of aviation fuel, old engine grease, and damp metal. A small single-engine Cessna airplane was parked directly in the center of the massive room. At the far end of the building, a solitary figure was sitting on a wooden stool near a cluttered workbench, illuminated by a single harsh fluorescent hanging light. It was Jack, the pilot who had flown my wife, the man who had silently facilitated my attempted murder. He was holding a metal wrench, staring blankly at an engine part resting on the table, but he was not actually working. His shoulders were heavily slumped, and his entire posture radiated a profound, crushing exhaustion. I did not announce my presence. I needed a weapon. I quietly scanned the dark corners of the hangar and spotted a heavy, solid steel crowbar resting on top of a wooden shipping pallet. I wrapped my bruised fingers around the freezing metal, feeling the comforting weight of the weapon in my hand. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking slowly across the concrete floor. I wanted to terrify him. I wanted him to feel the exact same paralyzing helplessness I had felt when I was dangling out of his helicopter. When I was exactly 15 feet away from his workbench, I intentionally dragged the heavy steel tip of the crowbar across the concrete floor. The loud, harsh scraping sound echoed violently through the cavernous hangar. Jack spun around instantly, dropping his metal wrench onto the floor with a loud clatter. He peered into the dim light, trying to see who had entered his private sanctuary. When I finally stepped fully into the harsh glare of the fluorescent work light, all the blood completely drained from his weathered face. He stumbled backward, his heavy work boots slipping clumsily on an oil slick. His eyes widened to an impossible size, filled with an absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked exactly like a man who was staring directly at a walking corpse. "You are dead," he whispered, his voice shaking so violently it barely sounded human. "I saw you fall." I took another slow, deliberate step forward, gripping the steel crowbar tightly in my right hand. "I survived the fall, Jack," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "But you might not survive tonight unless you start telling me the truth." My words broke him out of his paralyzed state. Jack panicked. He reached frantically into the deep pocket of his heavy leather aviator jacket and pulled out a small black semi-automatic handgun. He raised his arm and pointed the barrel directly at my chest. But something was completely wrong with this picture. I stopped walking and stared closely at the man holding me at gunpoint. He was not a hardened, cold-blooded mercenary. He was not a ruthless contract killer protecting his blood money. The heavy metal weapon was shaking violently in his grip. His breathing was rapid and shallow, bordering on a full-blown panic attack. He was holding the gun with both hands, but he looked completely terrified of it. I realized instantly that Jack did not want to shoot me. He was a broken man standing on the absolute edge of his sanity. "You do not want to do this, Jack," I told him calmly, keeping my own voice entirely level. You are a mountain pilot, not a murderer. Put the gun down before you make a mistake you cannot take back. My calm words shattered whatever fragile defense he had left. Jack let out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed tragically in the empty hangar. His hands shook so severely that I genuinely feared the weapon might discharge accidentally. You have absolutely no idea what they did to me, he cried out, hot tears instantly spilling down his cheeks. You think I wanted to fly that helicopter for your wife? You think I wanted to sit there and watch her push you out into the freezing sky? I close my eyes every single night and I see you falling through the clouds. It is completely tearing my soul apart. I lowered the heavy steel crowbar, slightly deeply confused by his highly emotional reaction. I asked him why he did it. I demanded to know exactly how much money Rebecca and her brother Greg had paid him to participate in my violent execution. Jack let out a bitter, hollow laugh that sounded entirely devoid of joy. Money, he gasped, lowering the trembling handgun just a fraction of an inch. They did not pay me a single dollar, David. They took my entire life hostage. He slowly lowered the weapon completely, pointing the barrel safely toward the concrete floor. His legs seemed to give out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily onto the wooden stool, burying his face in his free hand. He began to speak rapidly, his words tumbling out in a desperate, suffocating rush of pure guilt. He told me he had a 19-year-old daughter named Sarah. She was the absolute center of his universe. She had struggled terribly with severe narcotic addiction issues a few years ago, but she had fought hard and remained completely clean and sober for over 18 months. She was finally putting her fragile life back together. 3 weeks ago, Greg had approached Jack at this very airfield with a highly detailed, expertly forged blackmail file. Jack explained that Greg was not just a powerful commercial real estate developer. Greg also quietly owned a massive, highly lucrative chain of private rehabilitation facilities scattered across the state. It was a dark, completely unregulated empire built on exploiting vulnerable families. Greg had sent his private security contractors to ambush young Sarah in a grocery store parking lot late at night. They had forcibly planted a massive quantity of illegal narcotics in the trunk of her car, and they had taken high-resolution photographs of the fabricated evidence. Greg had brought those horrifying photographs directly to Jack. He told the terrified father that if he did not agree to fly the luxury charter flight for his sister Rebecca, and if he did not completely ignore whatever happened in the cabin during that flight, he would immediately hand the photographs over to the state police. But the blackmail was far more sinister than a simple threat. To ensure Jack's absolute, unwavering compliance, Greg had utilized his deep political connections to legally force Sarah into one of his remote, high-security rehab facilities against her own will. He had cited the fabricated photographs as emergency medical evidence to a corrupt local judge. Sarah was currently locked inside a heavily guarded concrete compound, entirely cut off from the outside world, completely unaware of the terrifying game her captors were playing. They told me that if I opened my mouth to the authorities, or if I tried to warn you before the flight, they would frame my little girl for federal drug trafficking. Jack sobbed uncontrollably, his heavy shoulders shaking with profound grief. They said she would spend the next 20 years rotting in a maximum security women's prison. She is absolutely all I have left in this world, David. My wife passed away from cancer 5 years ago. I could not let them take my daughter away from me. I had absolutely no choice. They own the local police department. They own the county judges. They hold all the power. I am so deeply sorry. I am so sorry I let that evil woman do that to you. I stood perfectly still in the dim, flickering light of the hangar, listening to the agonizing truth pour out of this utterly broken father. The burning, consuming hatred that had carried me all the way to this remote, rural airfield suddenly vanished from my chest. It was instantly replaced by a cold, highly calculating clarity. Rebecca and Greg were not just greedy corporate criminals trying to steal my $2 million buyout. They were absolute sociopathic monsters who viewed human beings as completely disposable pawns in their sick, twisted games. They had viciously destroyed my entire life for money, and they had ruthlessly destroyed Jack's entire life for leverage. We were not enemies. We were both desperate, bleeding victims of the exact same predators. I opened my right hand and intentionally dropped the heavy steel crowbar onto the concrete floor. The loud metallic clang made Jack jump nervously. I walked slowly across the room, completely unarmed, and stood directly in front of him. I reached out and gently pushed the barrel of his handgun completely down. "You do not need to hold that weapon anymore, Jack," I said quietly, offering him a look of genuine understanding. "I am not your enemy." Jack looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and deep, crushing exhaustion. He looked like a man who had not slept a single minute since the horrifying day of the flight. I asked him if he knew exactly which private facility Greg was keeping his daughter in. Jack nodded weakly, wiping his eyes with the back of his dirty sleeve. He said it was a highly secure private compound located deep in the dense woods about 50 miles south of the city. It was surrounded by tall electrical fences and constantly patrolled by armed private security contractors. I took a deep, steadying breath, fighting through the sharp, agonizing pain in my fractured ribs. I looked Jack dead in the eye and told him that the rules of this deadly game had officially changed tonight. I explained that Rebecca and Greg did not actually have access to the $2 million yet. I told him the highly confidential secret about the cryptographic hardware key I had swallowed right before I hit the ground, and how that massive sum of money was currently trapped securely in a digital escrow account. I told him they were entirely vulnerable right now, and they did not even know it yet. "They think they hold all the cards right now," I told him, my voice growing stronger and more authoritative with every single word. "They think you are too terrified to ever speak, and they firmly believe I am too broken and powerless to fight back. But they made a massive, fatal miscalculation when they orchestrated this tragedy. They left us both alive." Jack stared up at me, a tiny, desperate spark of hope finally appearing in his tired, bloodshot eyes. He asked me what two men could possibly do against people with that much money, influence, and raw power. I told him we were going to systematically tear their entire comfortable empire down to the ground. I told him we were going to break his innocent daughter out of that corrupt prison, and then we were going to make my wife and my brother-in-law pay dearly for every single thing they had done to us. "But I absolutely cannot do it alone," I said, holding out my bruised, bloodied hand toward him. "I need an experienced pilot. I need someone who knows how to operate efficiently in the blind spots. I need a dedicated partner who has just as much to lose as I do." Jack looked down at my outstretched hand for a long, heavy moment. He slowly placed the handgun down on the workbench. The terrified, broken look in his eyes gradually shifted into something much darker and far more dangerous. It was the terrifying look of a devoted father who was finally ready to go to war for his child. He reached out and gripped my hand with a crushing, powerful intensity. The alliance was firmly forged in the freezing shadows of that empty rural hangar. We were two desperate men who had absolutely nothing left to lose, standing firmly together against a massive, corrupt machine. We spent the next 3 hours sitting on the oily floor of the hangar, meticulously mapping out a highly aggressive, deeply dangerous plan to save his daughter and permanently expose Rebecca to the world. I sat on a cold, folding metal chair inside the cavernous aviation hangar. The brutal winter storm that had nearly claimed my life in the mountains was finally beginning to break. Thin rays of pale morning sunlight pierced through the high, dirty glass windows, casting long shadows across the oily concrete floor. Jack had given me a clean flannel shirt, a hot cup of black coffee, and a safe place to breathe. But more importantly, he had given me the resources to launch my counteroffensive. I reached into my pocket and felt the hard, solid shape of the cryptographic hardware key wrapped securely in a small piece of cloth. It was the ultimate prize. It was the singular object that my wife had violently kicked me out of a flying helicopter to steal. We had spent the entire night mapping out every single detail of our aggressive plan to save his captive daughter and completely expose the monsters who had ruined our lives. But before we could execute the physical rescue operation, I needed to completely paralyze my enemies. I needed to freeze my wife and her powerful brother in a state of absolute unadulterated panic. I needed them to know that the massive fortune they had committed murder for was entirely out of their reach. At that exact moment, 20 miles away in the bustling heart of downtown Seattle, Rebecca and her brother Greg were confidently walking into the massive glass lobby of the Federal Bank. I knew their exact schedule perfectly because I had meticulously built the corporate timeline they were currently trying to hijack. They were undoubtedly dressed in their finest tailored suits, practically tasting the $2 million they believed was legally and permanently theirs. I could easily picture the arrogant, triumphant smiles on their faces as they sat down in the plush leather chairs inside the bank manager's private mahogany office. They were expecting a very simple standard signature verification process. They were completely expecting the senior manager to hand them a printed confirmation receipt, solidifying their perfect bloodless white-collar crime. They believed I was either lying dead at the bottom of a frozen ravine or running like a terrified coward through the city streets. Instead, they hit a massive, impenetrable brick wall of federal security protocols. The bank manager was a strict, humorless man who absolutely did not care about Greg's local political connections or Rebecca's highly practiced fake tears. He typed his secure credentials into the banking terminal. I knew exactly what the computer screen flashed back at him in bright red letters. Error. Cryptographic handshake failed. Secondary physical authentication required. The manager would have looked right over his glasses at my grieving widow and calmly explained that the massive $2 million corporate buyout was securely locked in a digital holding pattern. He would have told them that the receiving escrow account absolutely demanded the physical insertion of my specific proprietary hardware key. Without that tiny piece of surgical-grade titanium, the entire fortune was completely frozen in cyberspace. No local county judge could override it. No fabricated police report could legally bypass it. I could vividly imagine the exact moment the warm color completely drained from Rebecca's beautiful face. She would have reached frantically into her expensive designer purse, her manicured hands shaking violently, realizing that the small metal device she thought she had successfully stolen during our violent physical struggle in the helicopter was nowhere to be found. Greg would have immediately lost his carefully crafted, arrogant composure. He would have leaped out of his leather chair, leaning aggressively over the mahogany desk, raising his voice to a threatening shout. He would have threatened the bank manager with massive corporate lawsuits, public defamation, and severe political retaliation. But federal banking algorithms do not respond to idle threats or angry rich men. The money was trapped. The perfect execution had yielded absolutely zero financial reward. They had committed the ultimate unforgivable sin, and they had not received a single dollar for their trouble. I picked up the cheap plastic burner phone from the metal workbench. My hands were completely steady. For the first time in nearly a week, the agonizing physical pain in my fractured ribs faded entirely into the background. I was no longer the desperate, bleeding victim dragging himself through the freezing snow. I was the silent architect of their impending destruction. I dialed the personal cellular number of the woman I had fiercely loved and trusted for 12 long years. I listened to the digital ringing tone echo in my ear, my heart beating with a slow, powerful, calculated rhythm. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice was incredibly tight, strained to the breaking point by the massive panic she was currently experiencing at the bank. "Hello," she snapped sharply. She was clearly expecting a call from one of her highly paid defense lawyers, or perhaps a corrupt local official she had bribed. I did not shout at her. I did not curse or hurl angry accusations. I did not let a single ounce of emotional weakness bleed into my voice. I spoke with a dead, absolute coldness that belonged entirely to a ghost. "Good morning, Rebecca," I said softly. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate, crushing, and profound. It was a suffocating heavy silence that spoke volumes about her current psychological state. I could actually hear the sharp, terrified intake of her breath. I could perfectly picture her freezing right in the middle of the bank lobby, the expensive leather purse dropping from her trembling fingers onto the marble floor. She was listening to the calm voice of a man she had personally kicked out of an open cabin door at 3,000 feet. She was listening to a dead man. "David," she finally whispered. Her voice was nothing more than a terrified, rattling gasp. It was the pathetic sound of a person whose entire, carefully constructed reality had just violently collapsed. I heard the corporate escrow transfer hit a slight technical delay this morning. I continued keeping my tone perfectly casual and completely devoid of human emotion. "It seems you are missing a very important piece of the puzzle. I just wanted to call and let you personally know that the hardware key is perfectly safe. It is resting right here in my pocket. And as long as I possess it, you are never going to touch a single penny of my company." She started stammering loudly, entirely unable to form a coherent sentence. Her flawlessly crafted mask of the grieving innocent widow was entirely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She asked me exactly where I was. She demanded to know how I miraculously survived the fatal mountain fall. She tried to force a tone of relief into her voice, claiming she was so happy I was alive, and that it had all been a terrible misunderstanding. The sheer, transparent manipulation was absolutely sickening, but the pure panic in her voice was absolute music to my ears. "It does not matter where I am." I interrupted, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that immediately silenced her fake tears. "What truly matters is that you completely failed Rebecca. You and your arrogant brother thought you were playing a brilliant game of chess. You thought you could just violently erase me from the board and casually inherit my entire life. But you made a massive, fatal miscalculation. You left me alive to tell the story. And now I hold the absolute only key to the vault." I could hear Greg shouting something completely unintelligible in the background. She must have put the mobile phone on speaker mode, or he was standing close enough to hear my voice bleeding through the tiny receiver. I wanted him to hear me. I wanted the arrogant real estate developer to know that his corrupt, untouchable empire was currently standing on highly unstable ground. "Listen to me very carefully," I commanded, cutting sharply through their frantic background noise. "You are going to do exactly what I tell you to do, or I am going to walk straight into the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am going to hand them this cryptographic key as physical evidence, and then I am going to introduce them to a very specific helicopter pilot who is currently standing right next to me, holding a highly detailed recorded confession about exactly what you viciously forced him to do." The line went completely dead quiet once again. The casual mention of the pilot was the final devastating blow to their confidence. They knew Jack was their ultimate, most dangerous liability. They firmly thought they had him entirely controlled by holding his young daughter hostage in their corrupt rehabilitation facility. But my words clearly proved that their evil leverage was rapidly crumbling. They were completely exposed to the light. "What do you want?" David Rebecca asked. Her voice was completely defeated, entirely stripped of all its former arrogance, cruelty, and false superiority. "I want my life back," I replied smoothly, "but I am going to take it entirely on my own terms. I know all about the massive public memorial gala you are hosting in my honor this coming Saturday. I know you officially invited the entire community, the church congregation, and the corporate board of directors to publicly mourn my tragic disappearance and collect sympathy donations for your fake trauma. It is a brilliant, highly disgusting piece of theater, and I am going to be your living guest of honor." "You are totally insane," she hissed, a tiny spark of desperate anger finally breaking through her overwhelming terror. "You cannot possibly show your face in this city. There is an active federal warrant for your arrest. The local police will have you in steel handcuffs the exact second you walk through those double doors." I smiled warmly, even though she could not see my face. "The federal warrant is for a man who allegedly embezzled client funds and fled the state," I reminded her calmly. But I am not fleeing anymore. I am holding the physical key that completely proves the funds are still entirely intact. You are going to bring the physical escrow release documents directly to that charity gala. You are going to sign a full unconditional corporate surrender, transferring total legal control of the company assets back into my sole possession. You are going to do this quietly, publicly, and without a single moment of hesitation. And if we refuse, Greg's heavy voice suddenly echoed through the phone. He had violently snatched the device from his sister's hands. His tone was highly aggressive, trying desperately to project ultimate strength, but I could easily hear the deep underlying tremor of raw fear in his rapid words. If you dare to show up at that gala, I will personally have my private security contractors drag you into the basement and finish the exact job my sister started. You are a homeless, wanted fugitive with zero resources, David. You have absolutely nothing. I laughed loudly. It was a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the high metal walls of the empty aviation hangar. I have the pilot, Greg, I said softly. And by Saturday night, I am going to have something else that officially belongs to you. Something you are currently keeping locked away against her will in a highly secure facility south of the city. I did not mention Jack's daughter by her name. I did not need to be specific. The vague, heavily implied threat was more than enough to completely shatter his false, unearned confidence. Greg knew exactly what I was talking about. He knew I had successfully discovered his ultimate point of leverage. You bring the release papers to the gala, I repeated, delivering my final, absolute ultimatum with unwavering authority. You smile brightly for the flashing cameras. You play the loving, relieved wife, and you give me back every single thing you tried to steal. If I see a single police officer waiting for me, or if you try to pull another violent, desperate stunt, Jack walks directly into the federal building, and your entire corrupt lives go up in flames. You have exactly 4 days to prepare yourselves. Do not disappoint me. I pressed the red button on the plastic phone, instantly cutting the active connection. I did not wait for a desperate response. I did not want to hear their pathetic negotiations. I tossed the burner phone onto the greasy metal workbench and looked across the bright hangar. Jack was standing near the metal wing of his small airplane, holding a heavy steel wrench. He had listened to the entire conversation in complete, focused silence. His weathered face was tight with intense concentration, but his eyes were burning with a fierce, protective, fatherly fire. He knew the stakes of our game had just been raised to their absolute maximum limit. We had effectively pushed a massive, highly dangerous hornet's nest right into the laps of our powerful enemies. Rebecca and Greg were terrified, cornered animals now. They were wealthy, they were deeply corrupt, and they were completely desperate. They would undoubtedly spend the next 4 days actively mobilizing every single dark resource they possessed to find me and silence me before the gala. They would heavily tighten the armed security around Jack's daughter, preparing for a potential violent assault. But they were officially reacting blindly. They were entirely paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying realization that the broken man they had violently pushed into a freezing mountain ravine was no longer a helpless, silent victim. I was alive. I was deeply angry. And I was holding the absolute, undeniable power over their financial and legal future. The escrow panic had successfully derailed their perfect corporate timeline, giving Jack and me the exact window of total chaos we desperately needed. I walked over to the wooden table where we had spread out a highly detailed topographical map of the surrounding county. We had spent hours aggressively circling the dense forested area where Greg's unregulated rehabilitation facility was located. The compound was heavily fortified, surrounded by tall electric fences and actively patrolled by armed private guards. Breaking Jack's daughter out of that rural prison was going to be the most dangerous thing either of us had ever attempted. "Are they going to bring the papers?" Jack asked quietly, his voice rough with deep exhaustion and heavy concern. "They do not have a choice," I answered, staring fiercely down at the map. The extreme greed that drove my wife to attempt premeditated murder is the exact same greed that will forcefully compel her to comply with my demands. She cannot physically walk away from $2 million. It is a psychological impossibility for her. She will bring the documents to the gala, desperately hoping she can find a way to manipulate the situation at the very last second. But she will not succeed. We just need to make absolutely sure we fulfill our end of the promise before Saturday night arrives. Jack nodded slowly, gripping the metal wrench tightly in his calloused hand. "We get my daughter back tonight," he stated firmly. "We hit the heavily guarded compound before they have a single chance to relocate her." I placed my bruised finger directly on the red circle drawn on the map. "We hit them hard," I agreed. The aggressive counterattack was fully in motion. The trap had been expertly set. The massive escrow account was frozen, holding their entire corrupt future hostage. All that remained was the violent, inevitable collision of our two worlds. The days of me playing the passive, trusting husband were entirely over. I was going to tear their evil empire down piece by piece, and the extraction of the innocent hostage was step number 1. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was bathed in the warm glow of massive crystal chandeliers. I stood quietly in the dark shadows of the coat check room, watching the sickening spectacle unfold through the crack in the heavy mahogany double doors. Rebecca had spared absolutely no expense for this charity gala. She was using my supposedly tragic disappearance to cement her status as a grieving victim. The room was packed with the entire congregation of the community church that had so eagerly turned their backs on me. At the front of the lavish ballroom, Rebecca stood on a raised stage behind a crystal podium. A massive digital projector displayed a beautifully edited slideshow of my face accompanied by soft, somber piano music. I watched my wife wipe a perfectly timed tear from her cheek as she leaned into the microphone, her voice trembling with fabricated grief. She told the silent audience how much she missed the man I used to be before the gambling addiction consumed my soul. She spoke about the deep trauma of discovering my horrible financial crimes and the agonizing pain of waking up wondering if I was lying dead somewhere. Pastor Thomas Miller sat in the very front row, nodding solemnly and dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. She asked the wealthy guests to generously open their checkbooks to the new foundation she had created. I looked down at myself. I was wearing a cheap gray suit that Jack had bought for me on our way into the city. My face was heavily bruised from the brutal beating in the alleyway and the terrifying fall from the helicopter. I had a slight limp, and my fractured ribs screamed with agonizing pain every time I took a breath. But as I stood there in the dark, I did not feel weak. I felt a burning surge of power. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open. The solid wood hit the brass doorstops with a loud, echoing crack that instantly cut through the soft piano music. Hundreds of heads turned toward the back of the room in perfect unison. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the bright golden light of the chandeliers. The silence that instantly crashed over the ballroom was absolute and terrifying. It felt like all the oxygen had been violently sucked right out of the room. Pastor Thomas Miller dropped his handkerchief onto the floor, his mouth hanging open in sheer shock. The board members of my software company stared at me as if they were looking at a breathing corpse. I did not stop walking. I moved slowly down the center aisle, my cheap dress shoes clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the stage. Rebecca froze completely solid behind the crystal podium. Her hands gripped the edges of the stand so hard her knuckles turned white. The color violently drained from her flawless face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost. The fake tears dried instantly in her eyes, replaced by a look of pure horror. She was looking directly at the man she had personally kicked out of a flying helicopter into a freezing mountain ravine. Seeing me physically standing there bruised but entirely unbroken completely shattered her mind. Greg was standing near the edge of the stage holding a glass of expensive bourbon. When he registered my presence, his face twisted into a mask of violent panic. He dropped his crystal glass onto the floor, letting it shatter, and aggressively signaled the private security contractors standing near the emergency exits. "Get him out of here," Greg shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. He is a dangerous federal fugitive. Restrain him right now." 4 massive men in dark suits stepped forward, rushing down the aisles to intercept me before I could reach the stage. The guests gasped and frantically backed away, expecting a violent physical altercation. I did not run. I did not raise my fists to fight. I reached into the breast pocket of my cheap gray suit and pulled out the surgical-grade titanium cryptographic hardware key. I held the silver key high up in the air, letting the bright light catch the metal. "Stop right there," I commanded, my voice booming across the silent ballroom with absolute authority. "I am holding the only physical security key that can unlock the $2 million corporate escrow account. If anyone lays a single finger on me, this key disappears forever, and you lose everything." The security guards hesitated, looking back at Greg for further instructions. But Greg was completely paralyzed, staring at the small metal object in my hand with desperate eyes. That was when Rebecca's sociopathic survival instincts finally kicked in. She was completely blinded by her absolute consuming greed for the $2 million. She realized I had actually kept my word. I had shown up to the public gala just like I promised, and I had brought the key. She instantly snapped out of her terrified trance, her calculating mind pivoting with speed. She pushed away from the crystal podium, grabbing a thick folder from the side table. It was the physical escrow release documents I had demanded. She rushed down the short steps of the stage, forcing a massive, hysterical smile onto her pale face. "David," she cried out loudly, her voice echoing with a completely new, sickeningly sweet tone. "Oh my God, you are alive. It is an absolute, undeniable miracle. You came back to me." She rushed forward, throwing her arms open wide in front of the stunned guests, desperately trying to play the entire situation off as a miraculous return of her lost husband. She wanted the crowd to believe her unconditional love had brought me safely home. But her eyes were locked entirely on the small metal key in my hand, burning with a vicious, uncontrollable hunger that told me the final trap was finally and officially set. Rebecca stepped closer to me. The scent of her orchid perfume hit my senses, bringing back sickening memories from the helicopter. She reached her manicured hand outward, her fingers trembling with fabricated relief and unadulterated greed. She wanted the small titanium key resting in my palm. She wanted the $2 million. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. Pastor Thomas Miller was practically leaning out of his front row seat, captivated by the miraculous return of the disgraced husband. Rebecca tried to grab my hand, her eyes locked entirely on the metal device. "Oh, David!" she cried out, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceiling. "We were terrified. We thought you were gone forever. Please give me the key so we can put this nightmare behind us." I did not move a single muscle. I stood my ground and looked directly into her eyes. I saw the absolute panic hiding beneath her beautiful facade. She knew that if she could get her fingers on that piece of metal, she could run to the federal bank tomorrow and finalize her hostile takeover. I closed my fist around the hardware key, pulling it safely away from her desperate grasp. The fake smile on her face immediately fractured. Her eyes widened with sudden, violent anger. She opened her mouth to whisper a threat to tell me that Greg had armed security waiting in the wings, but she never got the chance to speak another word. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the grand ballroom swung open. The crash of wood striking brass echoed like a gunshot through the silent space. Everyone turned away from the stage. Rebecca froze completely solid. Greg dropped his aggressive posture and stared blindly at the entrance. Walking down the center aisle of the lavish hotel ballroom was Jack Reynolds. He was not wearing a cheap suit. He was wearing his heavy leather aviator jacket, looking exactly like the rugged mountain pilot he truly was. He was not walking alone. Flanking him on either side were 2 tall state police detectives wearing dark suits and carrying official badges on their belts. The crowd of wealthy donors and church congregation members gasped in collective shock. The piano player, who had been softly playing in the corner, abruptly stopped, leaving the room in suffocating silence. Jack marched directly toward the raised stage, his eyes burning with a fierce protective fire. He had spent the entire morning helping me orchestrate the highly dangerous rescue of his captive 19-year-old daughter. We had successfully pulled her out of Greg's corrupt rural compound just hours before this charity gala began. She was finally safe, resting securely in a federal protection motel. And because his daughter was safe, Jack was no longer a terrified hostage. He was a furious father ready to burn their empire to the ground. The two state detectives stepped onto the edge of the stage, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Greg immediately recognized the catastrophic reality of the situation. The arrogant real estate developer completely abandoned his carefully crafted image of power and control. He turned his back on his own sister and sprinted frantically toward the side emergency exit door. He shoved a wealthy, elderly donor out of his way, sending the woman crashing into a table of crystal champagne glasses. The shattering glass rang out sharply. "Stop right there," one of the detectives shouted, his voice commanding absolute authority. Greg did not stop. He reached out for the brass exit handle. But the private security contractors he had personally hired to throw me out of the building realized the legal tides had violently turned. Two massive security guards stepped directly in front of the door, blocking his escape path. They tackled Greg hard to the polished marble floor. His custom-tailored suit ripped loudly as his face slammed against the ground. The second detective walked over, pulled steel handcuffs from his belt, and locked Greg's wrists behind his back. The chaos in the ballroom was deafening. Guests were screaming and backing away from the stage. Pastor Thomas Miller stood up, his face entirely pale, realizing the tragic story he had been preaching to his congregation was a complete fabrication. Jack walked up the wooden steps and stood right next to me. He pointed a steady, calloused finger directly at Rebecca. "She threatened my daughter," Jack declared. His voice was incredibly loud, carrying a raw, emotional weight that completely silenced the panicked crowd. "She held my innocent child hostage in a corrupt facility. She made me fly that luxury helicopter. She forced me to ignore the screams. And then she pushed him out the open door into the sky." Rebecca stumbled backward against the crystal podium. She raised her trembling hands, desperately trying to play the innocent victim one final time. "That is a lie," she screamed, hysterically, fake tears streaming down her face. "He is a crazy man. They are both dangerous criminals trying to extort me. Do not listen to them." Jack did not argue with her. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. It was the recovered black box cockpit recording from our flight. He connected the device directly to the microphone cable resting on the podium. A sharp burst of static filled the massive ballroom, followed immediately by the crystal clear sound of the helicopter engine. And then the entire wealthy community heard the cold, sociopathic voice of my wife echoing from the massive overhead speakers. "You are so weak, David," the recorded voice of Rebecca stated with absolute malice. "You are a pathetic failure as a man. You are too soft to handle real money." I watched the remaining color drain completely from her face. The undeniable proof of her betrayal washed over the stunned audience. The trap had permanently snapped shut. She fell to her knees, completely destroyed, as the detectives stepped forward to place her under arrest. The heavy click of the cold steel handcuffs locking securely around the wrists of my wife was the most profoundly satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I stood perfectly still on the raised wooden stage of the grand ballroom, watching the magnificent illusion of her perfect life completely shatter into a million jagged pieces. The state police detectives did not offer her any gentle courtesy or special treatment. They read her the Miranda rights in loud, clear voices that echoed perfectly across the silent, horrified crowd of wealthy donors and church congregation members. Rebecca did not look like a glamorous grieving widow anymore. Her expensive designer evening gown suddenly looked completely absurd against the harsh, brutal reality of her criminal arrest. Her perfect blonde hair fell in messy, tangled strands across her pale, terrified face as the police firmly escorted her down the center aisle and out of the luxury hotel. Greg was already sitting in the back of a marked police cruiser with his head bowed in absolute total defeat. His massive, arrogant real estate empire was officially crumbling into dust before the night was even over. The private security contractors he had personally hired to intimidate me had instantly stepped aside when the state detectives revealed their badges. The wealthy guests who had just written massive sympathy donation checks to Rebecca's fake charity foundation were rapidly backing away toward the exits, entirely desperate to distance themselves from the unfolding criminal nightmare. The days that followed that dramatic charity gala were a chaotic, exhausting blur of intense federal legal proceedings and constant police interviews. The local television news stations that had eagerly broadcast Rebecca's fake crying just a few days prior were now frantically covering the massive extortion and attempted murder scandal. Jack handed his digital black box audio recording directly to the federal prosecutors. Once the seasoned investigators heard Rebecca's cold, sociopathic voice commanding my violent execution inside that helicopter, the criminal case was entirely closed. The state police conducted a massive midnight raid on Greg's corrupt rural rehabilitation facility and dismantled his illegal operation entirely, finding countless other innocent victims he had brutally blackmailed and held captive over the years. The elaborate web of forged bank statements and fake client emails that they had expertly used to frame me for corporate embezzlement unraveled within hours under the intense scrutiny of federal forensic accountants. Every single false charge against me was permanently dropped. The state prosecutor issued a formal public apology clearing my name across every major publication and news network in the entire city. And then the senior bank manager personally finalized the escrow release paperwork. The massive $2 million corporate buyout cleared flawlessly into my personal accounts. I was officially a very wealthy man again, but the massive sum of money felt entirely different now. It was no longer just the financial reward for 10 years of building a software company. It was a solid, undeniable monument to my survival. It was the absolute undeniable proof that they had completely failed to erase my existence. But the official clearing of my legal name did not bring the deep emotional peace I foolishly thought it would bring. The exact same people in my community who had so eagerly turned their backs on me suddenly wanted to make desperate, pathetic amends. My mobile phone was constantly flooded with apologizing text messages and desperate voicemails from former business partners and supposed neighborhood friends who had blindly believed Rebecca's lies without asking a single question. I ignored every single one of them. The only person I agreed to meet with was Pastor Thomas Miller. He repeatedly asked me to visit his private office at the community church one last time so he could properly apologize. I agreed to go, but I did not go for reconciliation. I walked into the exact same carpeted room where he had previously counseled my early marriage, and I sat down heavily in the leather chair across from his massive oak desk. Thomas looked 10 years older than the last time I spoke to him on that freezing county jailhouse telephone. He nervously wiped the sweat from his forehead and offered me a trembling, lengthy apology. He talked extensively about how incredibly deceitful Rebecca was, and how masterfully she had manipulated the entire church congregation with her highly advanced artificial intelligence audio recordings. He begged me to completely forgive the church leadership, and he practically pleaded with me to return to my regular designated seat in the front pew on Sunday morning. I sat there quietly listening to his desperate, hollow excuses, and I realized I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. There was no lingering, burning anger in my chest, and there was certainly no grace or forgiveness. There was only a cold, empty space where my deep spiritual respect for him used to live. I looked him directly in his tired eyes, and I told him the absolute brutal truth. I told him that the church congregation did not believe Rebecca's horrible lies because her fake digital evidence was undeniably perfect. They eagerly believed her terrible lies because they never truly knew my real character in the first place. 15 years of my loyal, dedicated friendship and my massive financial donations to his community programs were instantly wiped away the very second someone offered the town a more dramatic, exciting narrative to gossip about. They loved the tragedy of the abandoned wife far more than they respected the integrity of the living husband. I stood up slowly from the leather chair, and I walked out of that community church for the absolute last time, leaving him sitting in total defeated silence behind his desk. Walking back to my car in the empty church parking lot, I finally processed the darkest, most terrifying truth of my entire traumatic ordeal. During the freezing, miserable nights I spent sleeping in that abandoned station wagon, I used to tell myself that the prospect of $2 million had somehow mysteriously corrupted my wife. I desperately wanted to believe that extreme financial greed had magically transformed the woman I fiercely loved into a violent, unrecognizable monster. But standing there in the bright, clear light of the aftermath, I realized how incredibly naive that comforting thought truly was. Massive amounts of money do not fundamentally change human beings. Money simply hands people a powerful microphone and completely exposes exactly who they have always been deep down in their dark soul. Rebecca was always a cold, calculating, silent predator. She was always entirely capable of unbuckling my safety harness and kicking me out of a flying helicopter into a deadly, freezing mountain ravine. The $2 million corporate buyout did not miraculously turn her into a ruthless murderer. It merely gave her the perfect motivation and the proper financial excuse to finally stop pretending she actually loved me. I knew with absolute certainty that I could not stay in Washington State for another month. The towering snow-covered Cascade Mountains carried far too many violent, chilling ghosts, and the busy downtown city streets held far too many hollow, familiar faces of people who had happily watched me burn. I needed a completely blank canvas to rebuild my shattered personal life. I packed a single heavy travel bag, and I moved far down the Pacific coast, eventually settling into a small, quiet coastal beach town in Northern California. The massive, crashing saltwater waves of the Pacific Ocean became my new daily horizon. But before I drove out of the northern city limits, I made one final, quiet, highly confidential arrangement with my primary wealth management firm. I used a very significant portion of my newly recovered company funds to establish a highly secure, anonymous educational trust fund. I fully funded the entire 4-year college tuition, living expenses, and specialized medical recovery costs for Jack's 19-year-old daughter, Sarah. I ensured she would have absolutely everything she needed to completely rebuild her fragile young life after surviving Greg's horrific captivity in that rural compound. Jack and I never spoke directly about the massive financial gift. We did not need to exchange emotional, awkward words of gratitude. We were two desperate, broken fathers who had been permanently tied together by a violent, traumatic event. And honoring his daughter's bright future was the absolute only acceptable way I could ever repay him for pointing that handgun at the concrete floor and choosing to stand by my side when I had absolutely nothing left to offer the world. The deep, severe physical wounds from my terrifying mountain fall slowly began to heal in the warm California sun. My fractured chest ribs firmly knitted back together over the passing months, and the deep, jagged, violent lacerations across my torso gradually faded into thick, permanent white scars. I spent my early mornings walking barefoot along the freezing wet sand of the western coastline, watching the thick gray marine fog slowly lift off the dark blue water. The icy ocean wind violently whipping against my face served as a constant daily physical reminder that I was still breathing and still moving forward. Surviving the sudden physical fall from the helicopter cabin was the most terrifying split-second moment of my entire existence. But the grueling emotional, psychological climb back up from the absolute bottom of that freezing, lonely ravine was undeniably the hardest thing I had ever done in my 42 years of life. Rebecca and Greg had ruthlessly pushed me into the dark abyss, fully expecting me to shatter into a million invisible pieces and quietly disappear forever. but they completely failed to realize that violently hitting the rock bottom is sometimes the exact solid foundation a man desperately needs to finally learn how to stand up straight. I permanently lost my wife, my community, and my false comfortable sense of security, but in the devastating process I successfully found my absolute core strength. I learned that true resilience is not about avoiding the fall, but entirely about refusing to stay broken in the dirt. The long journey of rebuilding a life from the ashes is never a simple straight line, but it is the absolute most important walk you will ever take in your time on this earth. If you have ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the exact people you trusted the most, if you have ever had your character violently assassinated and your entire world stripped away in the blink of an eye, you know exactly how suffocating that heavy darkness can truly feel. You know the exact pain of waking up and realizing the person sleeping next to you is actually your greatest enemy. But you also know the unparalleled fierce strength it takes to finally stand back up and claim your life back on your own specific terms. I want to hear your personal story of survival and resilience. Drop a comment down below about a specific time you had to completely start over after facing a massive personal betrayal, and tell me exactly how you found the inner courage to rebuild your life from the scattered broken pieces. Do not forget to gently hit that like button, share this video with someone who is currently fighting a silent, heavy battle they cannot easily talk about, and press that subscribe button to join our growing, supportive community of survivors. Because no matter how hard the bitter world tries to violently push you down, hitting the cold ground is never the end of your story. It is only the very beginning of your greatest comeback.